you want to go and stand over there?
Okay, there's a microphone.
There's a microphone there. We just got to make sure it's switched on. Somebody just check that that's switched on. It is. So please, thank you very much. And I should say Louis Kasekende is Deputy Governor of the Bank of Uganda.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I think a number of points that the panel has been reflecting on have come out in the presentation, and I'll just add some very quick footnotes for you to note. The first one is, I think the question that was asked by the Honorable Minister, how has the world changed over the last about 40 years? And what do we learn from these changes in terms of setting the agenda going forward? So that is number one. But the one point that should be underscored is that, yes, we've referred to the group of countries, but we should also note that there is diversity among these groups of countries. I think the chair did point to natural resource rich, natural resource poor. So at the end of the day, this agenda must be aligned to country circumstances. The second point relates to, again, this whole question of what has changed in the world. We've seen that the emerging economies have achieved a lot in terms of convergence to the developed countries. This is better? Okay. That the emerging economies have achieved a lot in terms of convergence, especially convergence to the developed countries. But one thing that comes out, and I think it came out in the presentation by Diarra, is that there is divergence between these least developed countries and when you compare them to the emerging economies. And I think that's where the challenge lies for us. Third point is that we are not dealing with basket cases, and I think that has again come out in the presentation. We're not dealing with basket cases. They have achieved a lot, especially during the last 10 years. Now, you ask yourself, what are the conditions that led to such good performance? And you will find a combination of domestic and external factors. The external environment was conducive to growth. Commodity prices in a number of countries, commodity prices for a wide range of commodities were very high during that period. We should not also overlook the point raised by the Honorable Minister that governance was also another factor, a capable state ready to make the choices for the benefit of these countries. My fourth point relates to global integration and contagion. As these countries integrated into the global environment, they were also exposed to the risks of shocks emanating from this global environment. And I think the point has been made by all the panelists that, yes, we've faced a food crisis recently. We face an oil crisis. We've faced a financial crisis. And given the weaknesses in the structures of the economies of these countries, they have been the most vulnerable. We face a risk of reversal of the gains we have achieved even in terms of poverty reduction. So there is a strong case for a global action. Global action, and I think this has again come out in the presentation, it has to be a global partnership between the donors. We have to look at the role of the multilaterals, but we also must look at what should be the role of the countries themselves. What should be the role of the regional groupings? What should be the role of the continental groupings? Now, this action, and I think again, this is something that has come out, and you'll find it a lot in the report. This is not an issue of just the aid. Someone said the inputs, just give them more aid. We must look at the elements of what it takes for these countries to gain sustainable growth and development. A capable state is one of the areas we must act on. Trade, we must act on trade. Regional integration, we must act on infrastructure, given that some of these countries are landlocked. So these are, and other issues are developed in our report. My last point, and I think this is something else that I would like to underscore, which came out from the presentation by the minister, that we need a monitoring framework. We need a framework for mutual accountability between these different stakeholders. It is not only good for the donors, as the minister was saying, you need to explain to your constituents, but it is also good for the LDCs. So I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's fantastic additional reflections there. And I think this is a good moment to open it up to you. Can I just make one reinforcing point around Luis Kasekende's remarks? I mean, we are absolutely not, I think we're in danger in a way of talking about this least developed country group if we don't recognise the diversity within and also the degree of progress that has been made amongst them. And we have a project here in ODI around development progress stories, and I've just looked at the list of least developed countries, and at least 7 of those progress stories come from within this group. And these are progress stories at scale, sector level, national level and above, ranging from Ethiopia through Bangladesh, Uganda and Malawi. So there is a lot to harvest in terms of learning from successes, but also a lot of challenge too, and I very much appreciate that as a message coming out. I want to now pull it out for your comment and reflection. I'm going to sweep across the room, take a few, please note down the questions because I'll ask you to cluster them, and then I will try and get everybody in. But you were first, so I feel I need to at least ask you, and then I will come to the others.
Thank you. Robin Greenwood of Christian Aid. I'd like to ask the Under-Secretary General and the Minister in particular how the UN and the UK will engage the newly emerged economies, such as the BRICS, in lifting the LDCs out of poverty, and also how you will be working to ensure that growth comes with equality and inclusion, so that the poorest citizens of the LDCs are not left behind and excluded as their economies grow.
Many thanks. Can you pass it right behind you, Marie?
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the Programme of Action Priority 4, Access to Essential Services. Marie Staunton had planned, first on behalf of all the civil society organisations working through Grow Up Free from Poverty on access to social protection. I'd really welcome the reference to social protection here. That's great. But 3 very quick questions. First, in order to plan access to essential services, you need birth registration. Otherwise, you don't know how many people there are, how to plan, how to monitor and evaluate. So shouldn't that be in there somewhere? Second, in terms of education, we would suggest that the Programme of Action framework moves from having separate targets from primary and secondary education to the investment that really makes a difference, and that's completion of 9 years quality of education, because all the figures show that that's what gives you the skills to be successful and have economic success. And finally, the Africa Regional Review meeting highlighted the lack of female teachers as a risk factor for the realisation of the gender equality goals in education. So shouldn't there be a goal set under the POA for the recruitment of female teachers?
Okay, thank you very much. Sheila Page down here, and then I'm going to sweep over to that. Sorry. This one and one more. And then
Thank
we'll
you.
get some
A question particularly to the Undersecretary and to the Minister, but you mentioned 8 priority areas. 3 of them dealt with agriculture, only 1 of them mentioned manufacturers and services. But some of the most successful LDCs and successful stories of LDCs come from services and from manufacturers. Why is there still this neglect? And the reason I bring in the Minister is because the UK and DFID has just illustrated this neglect by choosing to withdraw support from UNIDO because it is doing too little. That doesn't actually seem to make sense, and certainly is a confirmation of the neglect of manufacturers.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take one question here that's come from Ghana to add to that, and then we'll have a think about your responses, then we'll come out for another round. This is from James in Ghana. What system is in place to make sure that aid is directed to the correct people it was intended for with regards to Africa, and what else can be done to boost earning power of people living in Africa? Undersecretary, would you like to take some of those
Yes.
points first, and then
Yes.
I'll pass you over to the Minister.
Thank you very much. As for the question asked by Mr. Green, I would like to say that BRICS are pretty much engaged in the development cooperation, most of them are doing a lot of effort to allow access of products and services coming from LDCs to the market without any duty, no quota either. China is doing that. India has done that. Brazil also have taken measures at the national level. And also these countries are inciting the private sector and national enterprises to come and invest in Africa and elsewhere. Indians mostly on telecommunication and medical structures. Chinese are infrastructure building all over Africa and also in the neighboring LDCs because we have 14 LDCs in the Asia and Pacific region. How to structure this? I think that the program of action would be the best avenue for all international community to take commitment through one framework, knowing what are the benchmarks, what are the dates for delivery, and that will be valid both for the traditional donors but also for the emerging countries. But let us not forget the commitment of LDCs themselves. On the priority number 4, access to birth certificate, that goes back to the issue of institutional capacity of the state. In many countries, the state has been absent because it lacks institutional capacity to deal with the basic services. So one of the calls contained in the program of action is to strengthen the capacity of the state to make it a developmental state that can not only set up regulatory frameworks, but also can contribute to make the benefits of any kind of dividend of growth trickle down to the most vulnerable people. And that also brings me to another question asked by Mr. Green about the inclusion of part of the growth. If you have a growth that does not create employment, you have a growth that does not allow the state to create social safety nets, then you have a problem, because you have in LDC 70% of the population have 30 years or less. And these are people yearning to get a job, to get a better living, and they're looking for good conditions to be able to get a job. So I think that the best way to deal with this, our philosophy is that the private sector on its own cannot allow to get an inclusive growth. It can allow the growth, economic growth, but the inclusive part of it, taking on board the social needs of the most vulnerable, requires the intervention of the state at a certain point. Manufacturing and services are a very important part. I was advocating in support of UNIDO just a few minutes before I got into this room. And this is a trend also that Africa would Africa and LDCs would certainly go for, because it helps adding value and retaining value on the raw material of these countries in their own countries, creating wealth, employment, and everything in the country. We are very much supportive of this, and this will be one of the main priorities contained in the outcome of the meeting.
Great, thank you very much. Mr.
Yeah.
O'Brien, pick up on some of those?
Certainly, some very good questions, and I think that just taking them in order, Robin Greenwood's points, he's absolutely right that, of course, it's vital that we engage in the right way with the BRIC countries. It's only very recently that we've even identified them as moving away from countries with whom we've had an aid relationship to one which we're now saying the way forward is to move to a partnership relationship. And of course, you then have to find what are going to be the points of comparable advantage in creating that partnership. I mean, one of the areas, it seems to me, as I travel around Africa, is to see so many of the enormous capital projects which the Chinese are putting in. But very often, as I saw in Malawi the other day, a wonderful new hospital, but not a road to it. There's no sewerage or water connection, and there are no people or kit inside. So it's important that we have an opportunity to go along and say, well, we could partner with you in a technical assistance way, because there's an enormous amount of experience from our past which would enable us to say, well, we could design this right from the beginning rather than having to retrofit so much of the investment. So there are partnership opportunities which will take time to develop, but they're very important that we do it in a respected, joint and mutual way. Yeah, you then also talked about how do we come up with growth which is with more equality and inclusion. And it is it's incredibly striking that most of the countries we're talking about have got growth rates that we give our right arm for. The difficulty is it's spread amongst such a narrow elite. It's very often because of inadequate capacity, law, regulation, fiscal collection, fiscal rules. A lot of the particularly resource-rich countries, the yield that you would expect from those precious assets is not coming into the exchequer. One of the false arguments is to say we must be the ones who mine it all. It has always been the case that the expertise to get stuff out of the ground, it lies with very few people in the international arena commercially, and they are the ones you have to contract to go and get it, because we cannot all be oil men and be successful. What's important is to have the regulatory context such that the yield, so that the country then, through democratic accountability and systems which we would seek to encourage of good governance, are going to make that available in the best pump priming way to help fuel the broadest possible economy with the broadest reach that's going to lift most people out of poverty. And that, in many ways, is where the inclusion comes from. I would caution you not to use the word equality, because otherwise, if we were to go down that route, we shouldn't be continuing in the 4 states of India, because it should be up to them now with sufficient money to go down a much more internally socialistic route to say, people can't get rich, they must now spread this wealth as soon as they've got it to everybody to be equal. And that would kill off the growth in India and actually be counterproductive to them and to all of us. So I think fairness, access, inclusion and pump priming through the broader economy and through transparent democratic accountability are better watchwords and won't get into difficulties about us seeking to have a partnership which might look as though, even if we might not mean it, look as though we were trying to impose on others what they should have as internal policies, which I think would be deeply counterproductive and taking us back some decades. So that's one point. On Marie Staunton's point, I thought that the issue of social protection is absolutely vital. I've seen for myself from Rwanda, apart from the normal cash transfers, which I think there's a lot of evidence now that as long as it's well managed is an extremely powerful way of dealing with that. It was fantastic to see a small social enterprise set up by some ladies in the terraces above Kigali, where with small rabbits and chickens that they were starting, I asked one of the ladies, what would you do with your first dividend, in effect? And she looked me straight in the eye and said, well, of course, I shall lend it to another woman further down the valley, and she will do the same. I mean, what better answer could you get? That's precisely why this is so powerful, and we need to pursue it. I agree with your point about birth registration. It's exactly the same question about capacity as, for instance, getting land tenure regularised, so you've got some ability to motivate somebody with a real sense of ownership who's going to develop that land to added value. They'll be the ones who organically demand, I need a road to get to market, I need a market that's fairly regulated, and they will then help the infrastructure capacity building. And a lot of that comes through regional economic integration, which helps to tackle one of the other points, where we ought to see a lot more women teachers, but particularly where, in addition to building teacher housing and latrines and things which actually help retain teachers, it means that we need to force through this accelerated process of keeping girls at school, because they will then become the teachers. But if, of course, we lose them at age 10 or 11, then they're unlikely to be teachers of the future. Sheila challenged me on UNIDO, which I must answer, and I've already been lobbied by Cheikh, of course, and indeed by Aja. So we went through a very rigorous process. We're making absolutely no bones about it. I'm afraid UNIDO did not score at all well. It has not reformed itself. It's not made...
No, it scored highly on efficiency. It scored low on consistency with UK objectives.
That's right.
UK objectives I was questioning.
Yeah. Now, so it scored low, and that's why we've had to be rigorous. Well, I hear what you say, but we have made our announcement, and I think that there are 4 organisations which we're withdrawing money from. There are another 4 in special measures, and we very much hope that we will stick with them. We will review them in 2 years, and if they've reformed, then they won't fall into the other. So, of course, in these times of rigour and making sure that my tax-paying constituents don't come and attack us for what they regard as being off track in terms of our own strategic objectives, we have to be extremely internally consistent. So sometimes I'm afraid it isn't welcome news, but I'm not going to pretend by giving you a normal pap answer to try and get you to smile at me. I'm going to be rigorous in making sure that we stick to what has been a really thorough process.
Great. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to go out for another round of questions and give you first bite at the next round. Okay. Right over here, gentleman in the front, and then two women together
Yes.
in red.
Thank you. David Seddon. I'd like to just pick up the point that Dr. Clarkey made about the vast amounts of money that are paid out in debt, and ask, I think, the Minister, really, and others to comment on their position on conditionality. Because I think many developing countries have argued that the constraints under the HIPC and MRD and so on actually do constrain the objectives of both of the PRSPs and of debt relief. So what is the view on conditionality, given that you say countries should definitely own their own programs of development?
Okay, thank you very much. Behind, two women together there.
Hello, I'm Serena OSullivan. I work at End Water Poverty, a global coalition working on water and sanitation. We applaud the commitment in the draft Istanbul Programme for Action to deliver water and sanitation to all LDCs by 2020. We as civil society, including LDC Watch, have today released a manifesto about how that ambition might be realised. But I was wondering if I could ask the panel how they thought that ambitious target might be delivered. Which processes would you be supporting, for example?
Okay, thank you very much. Next to you.
My name is Stephanie Gill from Tier Fund, and I have a follow-up question to that. With regards to your water and sanitation strategy, of course, you've just mentioned the need for girls in education. Of course, the water and sanitation plays a huge part in that. So I was wondering, will you be encouraging civil society, donors and LDCs to participate in the Sanitation and Water for All, a global framework for action as part of your strategy to achieve universal access to water and sanitation by 2020 and as part of your partnership approach? And if so, how key do you think that process will be to achieving this?
Thank you very much. I'm going to swoop right round now to the back, Andrew Shepherd and his neighbour, and then I'll come here, and then we'll have another round, and then I also want to give a few moments to Richard towards the end. Yeah, Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Shepherd from ODI. I like the emphasis on vulnerability and social protection which has emerged from the discussion so far. There is, I think, very good research, including some by the Chronic Poverty Research Centre in 6 LDCs, indicating that vulnerability is a substantial part of the explanation for the persistent poverty which Mr. Diarra was referring to, and also that it prevents poor people from participating in the growth which is occurring. It's one of the factors that prevents poor people from participating. And I was wondering if the speakers could speculate about the kind of more protective package which might emerge from the Istanbul conference. What sort of initiative around safety nets, social protection, insurance do you envisage coming out of this? Thank you.
Could you pass it to your neighbour, please, Andrew?
Donald Curtis, of now of no institutional alignment. I want to claim a right, to advocate for a right to inconsistency. Because it seems to me that development success over recent years has been strongly associated with completely inconsistent development policies. And I'd point to China in that respect, which may sign up to WTO agreements, but whose terms of development could not conceivably have happened if they actually followed those rules. And likewise India, which happily manages to put alongside each other the vestiges of Fabian socialism and new libertarianism. And indeed, I talked to Britain, where we have fairly recently seen Gordon Brown make a complete flip from one kind of economic strategy towards another. And I don't think that developing countries have a hope in hell of finding a consensus around world-agreed policies that can lead to sustained growth. And I would like to argue that the Minister and others allow room for inconsistency. I don't quite know how to do this, but this is my advocacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An appeal maybe for heterodoxy. Right at the front here. Thank you very much.
Raffaella Bellanca, consultant in Sustainable Energy and Communication. We mentioned economic growth, and my question here is what role do the panelists see in access to energy? What role access to energy has to play in the achievement of economic growth? Even climate change is one of the goals. And what do you think is the role of energy in the mitigation and indeed adaptation in climate change? There is the risk that least developed countries are going to be trapped in the fossil fuel problem that we will face in the coming years. They will not have the purchasing power for acquiring the energy they need to develop.
Thank you. And finally here to Sir Richard Jolly. Sorry.
I'm not so much asking a question, wanting to make 3 points at the moment.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to make a first rather pro-British point, if I may, that the British record with respect to the least developed countries, which has already been brought out somewhat by the Minister and by Sheikh, actually has got several other points that are well worth quoting. Not merely has the amount of resources to least developed countries more than doubled in the case of UK over the last 10 years, but in the recent bilateral aid review, 17 of the 28 countries are least developed countries. And I think that's, I was interested and surprised when I counted that. It was very good. People may also be interested to know that the definition of least developed countries has been enormously improved, refined by the work of Francis Stewart of Queen Elizabeth House, Oxford, on the UN Committee of Development Planning, now Development Policy, to emphasize not just low income, but weak assets, both human assets and others, and various dimensions of vulnerability. So I hope UK in this area can feel that it's made an important lead. Second major point, many of the proposals for the least developed countries, both in the draft plan of action, in the eminent persons group, deal, as emphasized, outside the area of aid, but in areas where the UK has many similarities in terms of policy. Foreign direct investment, technology, adaptation, support of climate change. The diversity of the 48 countries has been emphasized. It's important to realize that quite a number of them, 18, 16, are, no, not quite so many, are small island states. And they really do need special support and attention. The final point I want to make is 3 challenges for UK. One, Mr. Minister, I hope you or Andrew Mitchell will be there at the conference, because I think it's not only shows will show a strong UK commitment, there is a lot that UK can bring to the conference in terms of challenges for all people on the donor side, including and ones which the UK itself will support. Secondly, in 2 areas, there's no need for additional UK money, but there is a great opportunity for UK leadership. One is that the Bretton Woods institutions have so far not accepted the least developed country category. They have a less developed country category, which is just defined in terms of income, not in terms of vulnerability or weak assets. And many of the proposals are not part of their portfolio of policies, and should be. And I think UK, with its leadership, could give a strong lead there. Secondly, in addition to the 17 least developed countries which UK directly supports, or in the new aid review, there is the question of where does Europe provide its resources? And many of the other least developed countries that are not on the UK list are on the European list because they're French French African countries. And again, I think UK in Europe could give a strong lead there. But finally, I hope the Minister or yourself, Stephen, will be there to give a strong personal leadership at this meeting, as well as a good delegation from DFID. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Right, I'm going to pass it back now to our speakers. We've only got 10 minutes to run. Mr. Carter, can I ask you to...
Okay, thank you very much. There is no specific question, but I would like to respond some of the issue that emerged here. First of all, on the aid issue, we would like to really emphasize quality than quantity. So if we don't really get quality aid, okay, if we only focus on aid effectiveness, not on development effectiveness, we want to see how much impact we are able to really make by allocating certain amount of resources to certain LDC. So that quality is very important for us. And the whole issue of related to this vulnerability versus poverty, but this is also very important for us. If you really just look at the number of poor people living in the world, there may be more poor in India than whole 48 LDC. So, but if you really look at from vulnerability angle, the poor people living in LDCs are more vulnerable than anywhere else. So vulnerability should be the angle of looking at prioritizing our policy and program and allocating fund. The other issue is social protection measure. That's somebody mentioned from here. In fact, the whole issue related to water, sanitation, and energy. In our LDC civil society campaign, we have been really emphasizing the issue related to water and energy poverty. It looks like a typical development project, but it will have a lot of scope of improving protection measures in LDCs. Water and energy, because we are also suffering from water and energy poverty. We don't have access to electricity, we don't have access to internet, we don't have access to modern scientific technology to save people's lives in LDC. So water and sanitation is among others, our major focus on LDC agenda. And we have organized several consultations in Pacific, Africa, Asia, and most of the civil society group coming together, and they are asking us to really emphasize the issue of water and energy poverty, and related to, if you really relate our campaign on MDG, no MDG without LDC. If you only work in China and India, you can achieve MDG. But if you really forget bottom billion, 48 poorest UN-defined country, we can't really achieve MDG in overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, Minister, I think next, and then I'll give Mr. Diarra the last word.
Right. Well, a number of issues. The question about the EU, which Sir Richard Jolly raised, of course, that's a very important aspect, because part of the way the bilateral and multilateral aid review operated was to recognise that in some cases countries will be better off not with a bilateral programme. They'd be better off either through an Africa regional programme such as Burundi or Lesotho, where now there's going to be a much greater likelihood. Lesotho is a good case in point. A bilateral programme of about £3 million per annum will engender, probably under the multilateral, with suitable encouragement to focus and accountability, which is what lies behind Sir Richard's question, not least through the EU, will get to about £10 million per annum. So that's an interesting case in point. Burundi, where they're going to benefit much more from Trademark East Africa as we break down the barriers for local economic regional integration, access to of a landlocked country into higher purchasing power markets, and access to ports, and so that exports can have a sustainable route to market, is going to be far more valuable now that our programme, as intended, had helped to build the revenue authority to help returning migrants. So that is an interesting set of examples. So how do we, given we're spending the best part of £1 billion a year, how do we see through what the EU is doing to help support those more regional and multilateral efforts in countries very often where we don't have a footprint ourselves? And that is work which I have to say is very much work in progress. I'm very conscious of the fact that that's something which I have under my remit, and we're working very hard to improve the amount of transparency through that process. There are two aspects to it. There's the European Development Fund, which is broadly working pretty well, although it does have long timelines and some inflexibility. And secondly, the area of money which is budgetized, and that is more difficult because it's formulaic in the amount that we contribute, and against a program which, of course, tends to be audit backwards rather than trying to project forwards, where one can have more influence. So, on the back of the very generous British record, which I was very pleased both to note and to thank you for highlighting that, I think that's simply, rather than I hope being too much of a sort of conceited pride, it's just a reaffirmation of our intent and commitment to try and build on the best and to move forward and to carry our influence. There's no question as to whether I or the Secretary of State can attend the conference in May is a matter yet to be decided. I think primarily it's to do with availability, it's not to do with intent. If I can be there, of course I shall be there. I know that there are other things in the diaries of all three of the ministers at the moment, so there's some discussion to be had. But if possible, I'm sure we would love to be, but I don't want to make a public commitment. Just very briefly, therefore, on the HIPIC constraints raised by David Seddon. I mean, I understand his advocacy for this point, but let's be absolutely clear. It is fundamental that we have accountability. It is vital that through HIPIC qualification and therefore getting to debt relief, which is a very quick and value for money relief. It's absolutely the right thing to be doing. But the conditionalities are, not least in things like public financial management, are essential to ensure that we have retained confidence that this is actually going to be a new stepping stone, a new platform forward, rather than simply being something which hasn't necessarily delivered. And it's a matter of judgment. It's a case-by-case basis. But I think to completely remove all conditionality would, whilst it would relieve the constraints without question, of course it would, I think it would leave us vulnerable to perhaps being more constrained in the future as to who we could put through the HIPIC process because of the difficulties of accountability that we must quite rightly face at the dispatch box, which is a pretty stern test, I can tell you. You've got everybody in front of you wanting your guts for garters and everybody behind you wanting your job. So it's pretty clear what you have to do. And then just very briefly, on energy and infrastructure, microfinance, micro-insurance, on the roads and telecommunications, of course there is a role for the local country and for country government and for aid donors. But primarily, the more we can help focus on the pump priming aspect of encouraging private sector development to deliver, then it's much more likely we'll get the multiplier effect and the sustained commitment to the maintenance of these assets once built. There has been a danger in the past that if one is always looking for the state to provide, once it's provided, nobody actually takes care of the asset. And part of the private sector development and being encouraged to do that is that one then has an asset which is much more likely to be sustained in country. That's an inadequate response, but I have to say it does mean I can avoid answering the question about inconsistency, which I find rather difficult.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I would just say one word about the conditionality of aid. If it's something that is constitute a constraint to the least developed countries, and the new program of action is trying to reduce as much as possible the conditionalities linked to aid. I think that the Paris Declaration, the principles that are contained there, move towards that direction also. Water and sanitation are two targets of the goal number 8 of the Millennium Development Goals. And it's also one of the targets of the current Brussels Program of Action, which is inspired by the Millennium Development Goals, because Brussels intervened 1 year after the summit on the Millennium Development Goals. So this issue would be taken up to the Istanbul Program of Action. I'm pretty sure of it, because we have made progress in providing drinking water to population. We have reached a level of 78% of population access to drinking. We do not want to lose that gain at this time of the process. So this is going to be consolidated. On the vulnerabilities and social safety nets, I think that there are many examples, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of schemes that have been tried successfully by different countries. So we just need to make a compilation of these and try them on the LDCs. We have school feeding programs. We have cash for work program. We have stipend for families sending children to school. We have insurance schemes to access basic medical systems and so on and so forth. So we're going to use all of this to see what's best fits the. And finally, on the energy. You cannot produce without energy. You cannot even consume efficiently without energy. If you don't have energy, you cannot be competitive on the global market. So it's a basic source of wealth, a creation of wealth. 2 billion people today live without any source of energy. And more than 1 billion people live on unreliable sources of energy. And billion of people have access only to charcoal and wood to heat themselves and cook their food. All this needs to be changed by leapfrogging towards a green economy that will use more renewable energy. That's where the support of the international community by experienced technology, but also funding, would intervene in order for the LDCs to be able to acquire these type of energies and get rid of the fossil fuel. But this is a long-term project. I would end by thanking you for giving me this chance to speak here, and we look forward to seeing you all in Istanbul.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
I think all it takes for me to do is to wish you and your team and all those who will participate in the Istanbul conference the very best of luck. It's
Thank
an
you.
important agenda and an important decade ahead.
It
Thank you
is.
very much indeed to everyone. Thank you.
Good. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very much.